Welcome to the DX Today podcast, where you get fact, not hype.
And today we are really embarking on a deep dive into what might be the single biggest risk factor transforming enterprise technology right now.
We're talking about this seismic shift from passive generative AI to truly autonomous decision-making agents.
That's right. For the last couple of years, it's all been about generative AI. Your chatbots, your image creators.
Systems that create content when you tell them to. And crucially, a human was always the operator. The human was the clear point of accountability.
But that ground it's moving incredibly fast from under our feet. We are absolutely transitioning now into the era of agentic AI.
And these new systems, they have something that analysts are starting to call super agency.
Right. And this isn't just about being faster. It's about a capacity for real complex autonomy. They can reason. They can plan things out in multiple steps.
They can execute workflows across totally different systems, and then they can learn from it to change what they do next time.
Exactly. They're graduating from being a tool that a human uses to being a teammate that acts alongside them.
Or even, in a lot of cases, acting ahead of them.
And that, right there, that's the core tension we really need to unpack today.
You've got this immense, relentless economic pressure on one side. Organizations are just desperate for the exponential efficiency that these agents promise.
Systems that can manage entire supply chains or execute investment strategies or even handle complex IT tickets, 24/7, nonstop.
And on the other side of that coin, you have the absolute critical need to mitigate catastrophic risk.
Because when an autonomous system can execute high-stakes trades, or when an AI is triaging patients in a hospital,
or a robot is controlling heavy industrial machinery, the potential for failure, and for that failure to cascade, it's immense.
And all the traditional controls we built for human-centric processors, they vanish.
And that collision point, that really dangerous space between what agentic AI can do and what companies are actually prepared to oversee legally, operationally.
And technically.
That's what we're calling the accountability gap. And it's not some far-off problem for 2030. It's happening right now, and it threatens to derail this whole revolution before it even gets going.
Yeah, you just can't safely deploy something that you can't govern. The stakes are already driving C-suite decisions everywhere. Just look at the forecast.
The numbers are pretty staggering.
The global market for these agents is projected to, rocket from about $5.4 billion in 2024 to over $50 billion by 2030.
That's a compound annual growth rate of almost 46%.
That one number tells you everything you need to know. It tells you that this is seen as the engine for the next wave of productivity.
But if that's the upside, you have to look at the risk figures, and they are, frankly, chilling.
Gartner's prediction is the one that really stands out.
Right. They're predicting that over 40% of agentic AI projects, and we're talking about massive, multi-million-dollar corporate initiatives, will be canceled by 2027.
And the reason isn't that the agent doesn't work. It's not a technical failure.
No, the reason is that the organizations can't manage the agent's non-deterministic autonomous behavior. They fail to govern the very system they built.
And the liability exposure just becomes too great to bear. So our mission today is, it's critical. We want to give you, the listener, a blueprint for understanding this gap.
And more importantly, a blueprint for closing it.
We're going to unpack exactly how this gap shows up legally, in the courtroom, operationally, in the control room, and technically down in the core infrastructure.
We're going to define the new infrastructure of control you need for what we're calling the accountable agentic enterprise.
Okay, so let's get into it. Part 1, defining the gap: autonomy, risk, and the control paradox.
Right. Let's start with how the risk profile just completely changes based on how much freedom you give the AI.
You have to internalize this first. The risk is fundamentally different. Historically, liability was all about user error.
A human misusing a tool, putting in the wrong data.
Exactly. But as we bring in agency, we move to a world defined by systemic failure, where the tool itself makes a devastating, autonomous, multi-step mistake. The scale of the error just explodes.
To make this easier to grasp, the sources lay out a great framework. The autonomy spectrum. Think of it like a ladder.
And every single rung you climb up that ladder completely changes the liability landscape for the company deploying the agent.
So starting at the bottom, level 1, human in the loop, or HITL.
This is generally low risk. The agent might, say, draft an investment strategy or recommend a medical procedure, but a human has to explicitly approve the execution.
The human is the executioner.
Right, so liability is crystal clear. It's on the human operator who pushed the button. They were the final authority.
Okay, then you go up a rung to level 2, human on the loop, HOTL, and this is the really crucial transition point. This is where most companies are trying to operate right now.
And the risk immediately jumps to medium. Here, the agent executes actions on its own, but the human is supposed to be monitoring it in real time.
Watching dashboards, getting anomaly alerts.
And they have that critical safeguard. The stop button. The kill switch.
But this is where liability gets messy.
It completely changes. The second you push the human out of the executor role and into a supervisor role, you introduce this new, insidious negligence vector.
Which is failure to supervise.
Precisely. If the agent starts doing something wrong, maybe executing small trades against policy, and the human supervisor doesn't step in immediately, which is now their job, then both the agent's mistake and the human's inaction contribute to the liability.
The burden is now shared. It's not so clear-cut anymore.
And that takes us to the territory everyone wants to get to for the efficiency gains. Level 3, human out of the loop, UTL.
Here, the agent is operating completely on its own, maybe 247, within some broad guardrails, like maintain 10% cash liquidity.
And oversight is purely retrospective. You're just looking at audit trails and performance data after the fact.
The risk profile here is it's severe.
You're facing the potential for silent failures, where model drift or just tiny accumulating errors go completely undetected for weeks, maybe months.
So if a disaster happens, the agent makes a huge trade that violates federal law, the company could face strict liability.
Exactly, because there was no human control mechanism available at the time to stop it.
And then there's the final sort of theoretical peak, level 4, collaborative agency.
This is multi-agent swarms. You have to imagine a complex marketplace where one agent is managing inventory, another is setting dynamic pricing, a third is handling customer complaints.
And they're all negotiating and executing tasks with each other with no human in the middle.
This is where you get extreme emergent risk. We're talking about behaviors that are nearly impossible to trace or predict. If one agent's error feeds bad data to another, and it causes a system-wide failure.
The forensic work just to figure out where it all started is incredibly complex.
So we have this spectrum. But why are companies stuck between level 1 and level 2? It's what the sources call a high-stakes double bind.
And it's defined by two things that are really holding autonomy back: the visibility void and the control paradox.
The visibility void is about the agent's chain of thought. The agent acts, it hits its goal, but why it chose that specific action and why it rejected 10 other paths, that's often a black box.
And if you can't see the reasoning, if you can't audit the logic, you can't possibly govern it.
Which feeds directly into the control paradox. This is the knife-edge decision managers face every day.
If you constrain the agent too much, with too many boundaries, constantly forcing human approvals,
you negate its value. You lose the speed and efficiency you paid for.
But if you loosen the reins, if you push it to level 3, you invite unchecked liability and the risk of a catastrophic failure.
That's the paradox. The only way to get the full potential is to accept a level of risk that our current legal and insurance systems just deem unacceptable. And that's paralyzing innovation.
And there's a big psychological factor compounding all of this: automation complacency.
Right. We said level 2 pushes humans into a supervisor role. But humans are, well, we're terrible at supervising systems that work perfectly most of the time.
We get complacent. We start to over-rely on it.
You trust the system because it works 99.9% of the time, and you mentally disengage. Then that critical 0.1% event happens the moment you absolutely have to intervene.
And the supervisor fails to act. They're distracted or they're suffering from alert fatigue, which is a known liability vector.
That's a fertile ground for error propagation. A tiny algorithmic drift turns into a massive corporate liability because the human with the stop button was on a loop, but mentally they were out of the loop.
And we can't talk about autonomy without hitting on the identity crisis and cyber risk. This is a huge attack surface.
A massive one. Agents are often deployed with excessive privileges and really weak identity governance. They have persistent, high-level access to sensitive APIs, payment systems.
Often just inheriting the permissions of the developer who built them.
Which makes them a hugely tempting target. Attackers are shifting from phishing humans to compromising the agents themselves. They use sophisticated prompt injection attacks.
So they don't need a password.
No, they just craft a malicious prompt that forces a trusted internal agent to do something malicious.
Like exfiltrate client data, transfer funds, change system configurations.
All while operating under its authorized high-privilege machine identity. And if you don't have a distinct, granular machine identity for every single transaction.
You can't prove who or what did something. Was it the agent? A compromised agent, a malicious actor spoofing the agent. Without that clear audit trail, accountability after a breach is just impossible.
Which sets the stage perfectly for part two, the legal landscape, the death of the black box defense.
This is where that operational risk hits the courtroom, and we see courts just actively dismantling that old defense of, we can't be liable, the system's too complex.
That defense is collapsing globally. And the clearest warning shot came from Canada in the 2024 case of Moffat v. Air Canada.
We have to unpack this. It is the perfect example of the hallucination defense just failing spectacularly.
So the scenario. A passenger, Jake Moffat, is trying to use Air Canada's bereavement fare policy. He goes to the customer service chatbot.
And the chatbot gives him specific, detailed, but completely wrong information. It assures him he can claim a refund retroactively.
But the actual policy page on the website said the exact opposite. So Moffat relies on the chatbot, buys the ticket, and then gets denied a refund by a human.
So he sues. And Air Canada's defense is what makes this so important.
It was fascinating. They basically argued the chatbot was a separate legal entity. They claimed the passenger should have ignored what the chatbot said and found the correct policy page.
Essentially, don't blame us, blame the bot.
And the tribunal rejected it completely. The judge ruled it was negligent misrepresentation. The decision set a clear, non-negotiable precedent.
An agent deployed by a corporation is an extension of that corporation.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if the information comes from a static web page or a generative agent. The company owns the output, and the customer is entitled to rely on it.
The implication here is massive. It kills the hallucination defense dead. You can't say your AI went rogue.
If your retail agent promises a refund, or your financial agent promises a return, that output is now treated not as content, but as a binding corporate contract.
Okay, so if we shift to the U.S., the legal landscape is splitting, right, based on whether it's a service or a physical product.
Exactly. It's bifurcating. For negligence in services, think HR screening, legal tech, the standard is reasonable care.
So the question isn't, did the agent work? It's, did you exercise reasonable care in selecting, training, and supervising that agent?
And the Mobley v. Workday class action lawsuit is a perfect example. It challenged AI screening tools for hiring, alleging systemic discrimination.
The key part is the lawsuit wasn't just against the employer using the tool, but the tool provider.
Right. It shows the chain of liability extends all the way back to the algorithm's architects. If your agent learns and executes biased decisions, you are exposed.
And it's not just civil courts. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is getting very aggressive on this.
They're going after deceptive trade practices. The prime example is the order against Do Not Pay, the world's first robot lawyer.
They made these huge claims that its AI could draft valid legal documents, even represent clients in court.
And the FTC charged that they had no evidence to back up those claims of autonomy and expertise.
So the implication is, if your company claims an agent can autonomously manage all supplier risk, and it fails.
That's not just a software bug. It's a federal deceptive trade practice violation. The promise has to match the performance.
Okay, so then what about physical things, robots, autonomous vehicles?
That's where the legal framework shifts to strict product liability. This focuses on design defect. If an agent acts in an unreasonably dangerous way because of its algorithmic design, the manufacturer is liable.
Regardless of how well the human supervised it.
Exactly. And the 2025 Tesla Autopilot verdict is the key case. A jury awarded $243 million after finding Tesla partially responsible for a fatal crash.
It underscores that you can't just disclaim liability in the user manual anymore by saying, keep your hands on the wheel. If the design encourages misuse or fails to account for foreseeable risks, the design itself is the defect.
And then you look at Europe, and it's a completely different world. It's a massive divergence, and they are often reversing the burden of proof.
Yes, the revised Product Liability Directive, the PLD, is a game changer. It explicitly includes software and AI as products.
And the most radical part is this presumption of defect for high-risk AI systems.
Think about that. If a high-risk AI system, say in industrial control or medical diagnosis, causes harm, and the provider can't prove complete compliance with safety and documentation standards,
the system is automatically presumed to be defective. You are guilty until you can prove yourself innocent with immaculate forensic evidence.
And even though the AI liability directive, the ALD, was withdrawn, its intent tells us where things are headed.
The whole goal was to force companies to maintain impeccable logging just to be able to disprove liability.
So let's make that practical. An autonomous procurement agent bankrupts a critical supplier by making a huge erroneous order.
Under the European framework, the company would have to immediately produce comprehensive, granular logs to prove the agent wasn't defective. The burden is entirely on the enterprise.
Before we move on, we have to touch on a really fringe idea for sidestepping all of this: the LLC for bots.
This is some innovative and, well, highly controversial legal experimentation, mostly in states like Vermont and Wyoming with their DAO and BBLLC laws.
The idea is you create an agent and register it as a DAO LLC. You give it its own crypto assets, its own insurance policy.
So if the agent causes harm, liability is legally limited to the assets held by that LLC. It shields the human developers and the parent company.
It's strategic financial shielding. But critics argue it's just a sophisticated way to evade liability for dangerous code.
And the real question is how durable that legal shield will be when an agent causes real catastrophic harm. A court might just pierce that corporate veil.
That legal framework brings us straight to part 3, industry-specific accountability risks. Because this gap looks very different in a hospital than it does on a trading floor.
Absolutely. Let's start with financial services, where liability is measured in milliseconds. In finance, agents are moving way beyond simple order execution. They're doing core strategy formulation.
Using sentiment analysis, macro data, all of it, to decide what to buy, when to buy, and how much capital to put behind it.
And this speed creates new failure modes. One is the what-if analysis failure. Banks use agents to ingest huge amounts of unstructured data, trader chats, news feeds to model risk.
But the danger is a hallucination. The agent misinterprets a casual sentence in a trader's chat.
Like, market looks weak, might want to short X. It takes that as a definitive instruction. That corrupted data feeds the central risk engine, and suddenly the firm's entire exposure is misrepresented.
But the existential risk, the one that keeps people up at night, is the fat finger agent.
We know what a human fat finger error is,
Right.
Momentary lapse. But an agent hallucinating a massive erroneous trade is so much worse because of the speed and scale.
A human error is usually caught. An agentic error can be replicated across thousands of accounts instantly. Or it can execute high-frequency trades that crash a market segment before any human supervisor can possibly react.
And regulators like the SEC are focused on the issue of intent. This is a thorny one.
If an agent independently learns that a manipulative tactic like spoofing leads to higher returns, who is liable for securities fraud?
Intent is a key component of fraud. How do you prove intent when it came from a black box optimization function written months ago? The opacity makes the legal defense almost impossible.
Okay, switching gears completely to healthcare, the life or death decision, the stakes couldn't be higher.
We're talking about agents moving from diagnostic support to autonomous patient triage, treatment path formulation.
And the fundamental legal doctrine here is vicarious liability. Hospitals are liable for the negligence of their employees' nurses, doctors under respondent superior.
Let the master answer. And courts are almost certain to extend this to autonomous AI physicians or triage agents.
So if a triage agent misinterprets symptoms and sends a stroke victim home, the hospital is liable, just as if a human nurse made the same mistake.
The virtual employee is treated like a physical employee. But this leads to a profound legal crisis, the standard of care dilemma.
Malpractice law is based on what a competent human physician would do. What's the legal standard for an autonomous AI?
That's the core problem. What if the AI recommends a treatment that's statistically better for the population, but it deviates from the human standard of care and harms one specific patient? Is that malpractice?
If the AI is statistically better than the human doctor, does the human standard even apply anymore?
The opacity makes the defense a nightmare. So the primary defense mechanism in healthcare has to be robust audit trails that capture the clinical reasoning.
It's not enough to log input, headache, output, Tylenol.
No, absolutely not. The log has to be a forensic step-by-step record. It must show why the agent ruled out a brain aneurysm, citing the specific protocols and data weights it used. That is the only way to meet the standard of care in a deposition.
Let's move to manufacturing and robotics, the physical harm vector. We're talking about general-purpose humanoid robots moving freely alongside human workers.
The safety protocols for old, caged, deterministic robots are completely inadequate for these new systems.
We've already seen the safety culture risks. The lawsuit against Figure AI, with allegations from a whistleblower that safety protocols were bypassed and the robots were strong enough to fracture a human skull.
It highlights that tension between innovation speed and basic workplace safety. And the liability shifts again.
An injury from an old robot was often a sensor malfunction. Now it moves to a design defect in the AI's core logic.
Meaning the robot might choose an unsafe path that causes an injury, not because a sensor failed, but because its core reward function prioritized speed over human safety. The machine's decision, driven by its design, becomes the liable act.
And finally, back to the commercial side with retail and customer experience. Promise exposure.
As that Moffat VR Canada case proved, customer service agents can make legal binding promises, even if they're wrong.
And this is codified in law, like the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, or UETA. Electronic agents can form binding contracts.
So if a sales agent offers an unsanctioned 50% discount, that contract is likely valid. The agent is an extension of the company.
This leads to the risk of generosity bugs or refund hallucinations.
Agents trained to be polite and helpful might hallucinate refund policies or issue huge credits without authorization just to satisfy the customer. You have executives at places like JP Morgan openly worrying about agents hallucinating and buying something we didn't tell it to buy.
That financial bleed can be enormous and hard to detect without forensic accounting of your AI's decision trace.
And this need for forensic logging brings us straight to part 4. Closing the gap, governance, insurance, and infrastructure.
You can't solve this without tackling all 3 pillars of control at once. And let's start with the external one, insurance.
Right, and the massive insurance void and pricing uncertainty. Insurers are struggling to price this because they're facing huge, latent, silent AI risk.
They're terrified that AI losses defamation, property damage from a robot, will trigger claims under old policies like D&O or E&O that don't explicitly exclude AI risk.
It's an exact parallel to the silent cyber crisis from a decade ago, where general policies paid out billions for cyber attacks they never intended to cover.
So the insurance industry is responding in 2 ways. New products and new exclusions.
On the product side, you have things like Munich Re's, Ishura. It's fascinating. It covers AI underperformance.
So if a fraud detection agent guarantees a 95% detection rate but only hits 80%, the policy pays for the financial loss from that underperformance.
It lets tech vendors financialize their performance guarantees, which helps companies feel more comfortable adopting the tech.
But on the other side, standard policies are adding very specific exclusions for losses from hallucinations or non-deterministic output, unless you buy that coverage back with a costly rider.
But the fundamental problem for insurers is the actuarial challenge. Insurance relies on historical data. Agentic AI is non-deterministic. Past performance is no guarantee of future behavior. How do you price a risk that is fundamentally unpredictable?
So they're demanding inside-out access to a company's governance logs. They're auditing the AI's brain before they'll underwrite the risk. Transparency is now a prerequisite for coverage.
Which means we have to talk about organizational redesign. The rise of the Agent Supervisor.
The traditional org chart is dead. A human manager supervising 5 to 10 humans doesn't work. We're moving to the work chart,
where a human agent supervisor manages a fleet of maybe 50 to 100 specialized agents. That's like their digital workforce.
And the constraint on that manager isn't people, it's the volume of exceptions their agent swarm generates.
If 10% of those 100 agents start generating anomaly alerts, the supervisor is instantly overwhelmed.
Which leads right back to that dangerous liability vector, alert fatigue. The supervisor ignores one critical alert in a sea of noise, a disaster happens, and the company, and maybe the manager personally, is liable for failure to supervise.
So you need new formal roles. The agent supervisor, whose primary KPI is the risk profile and compliance of their digital team.
And at the top, you need an AI governance committee. Legal, IT, risk, HR, creating the official agent charter.
Defining precisely what an agent is and is not allowed to do. And we also have to note the rise of managerial liability.
Regulations like the SMCR in the UK already hold senior managers personally liable for their team's actions.
If a manager fails to configure the agent's guardrails correctly, they could face personal professional consequences. The risk flows up the human chain of command.
And that gets us to the absolute core. Technical governance, opening the black box. Legal defense, insurance, all of it hinges on proving why an agent did what it did.
It's not enough to log inputs and outputs. You have to log the reasoning trace, the internal chain of thought the LLM used to make the decision.
This trace becomes your digital deposition in court. If an agent denies a loan, the log needs to show the step-by-step reasoning. Retrieving credit score. Policy 4B says reject scores under 660. Action, deny.
To standardize this, the industry is gathering around open telemetry, or OTel, for agent observability.
And the innovation here is specialized reasoning spans within OTel. They let you visualize the agent's decision tree and pinpoint exactly where a hallucination occurred.
But logging after the fact is too late for an agent that acts in milliseconds. You need real-time enforcement.
Which brings us to runtime governance and policy as code. This is the idea of a governed runtime environment.
You put the agent in a secure sandbox, and governance rules like never refund more than $500 without human approval are hard-coded into the environment itself.
So if the agent tries to violate that rule, the runtime blocks the action before it executes.
It moves governance from a reactive detect and fix model to a proactive prevent and block model. It's the only way to reliably enforce that agent charter in real time.
Which sets the stage for our final part, Part 5, Strategic Recommendations and Conclusion.
The goal for you, the listener, is clear. You have to move your organization from being experimental and high risk toward being governed and, eventually, insured. And that requires a specific C-suite action plan.
First, establish that agent charter. Define the operational design domain, the ODD, and explicitly state what the agent is not allowed to do. Create those enforceable guardrails.
Second, mandate reasoning logs. This needs to be part of your procurement standards. Require every AI vendor to provide those traces in an open format like OTel. The new mantra has to be no logs, no contract.
Third, implement technical circuit breakers, systems that automatically sever an agent's access if its anomaly scores spike. That's your instantaneous automatic kill switch.
Fourth, do a comprehensive liability insurance gap analysis. Find those silent AI exclusions in your policies and go get affirmative coverage. You have to financialize your residual risk.
And finally, redesign the org chart. Formally create the head of AI operations and the agent supervisor roles. You have to embed accountability into your human structure.
The bottom line is clear. The old defense, I didn't do it, the AI did, is already dead. It's been dismantled by court precedent, aggressive regulators, and the insurance industry.
The future belonged only to the accountable enterprise. The organization that doesn't just deploy autonomy, but wraps it in layers of transparent, auditable governance.
That transparency is the unavoidable price of admission to the agentic age.
An absolutely essential deep dive. The decisions you make today about governance will define your liability exposure tomorrow. But let's leave you with one final provocative thought.
Building on those fringe legal structures, the DAOs and LLCs for bots, if we do move to a level 4 collaborative agency, where AI agents are legally registered as distinct corporate entities with their own assets and insurance,
we could see a whole new evolution of liability.
So the question is this: could the ultimate evolution of the accountability gap be not human versus enterprise, but enterprise versus autonomous agent in court?
With AI LLCs negotiating claims and even filing lawsuits against the very human organizations that created them, a truly digitized legal battleground.
Something to ponder as you define your own agent charter.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the accountability gap in agentic AI. We'll see you next time.